let's go. So we got welcome back. Well, looks like we got the closest thing to hell in the USA by Farewell McGree. I'm gonna link the video down below in the description. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe if you have not already. I appreciate you. And let's get into it. Oh, I hope I didn't heard that. I promise. Oh, I did. I did.
About a decade before the Civil War started, a different transformation was occurring in the social fabric of America, one pertaining to the world of psychiatry. Before the 1850s, individuals who were considered to be mentally unfit to participate in mainstream society were often left destitute on the absolute fringes of it. They routinely lived out their lives in jails, poorhouses, and other such institutions that weren't designed with the idea of care or any sort of rehabilitation. This was a problem that Dorothea Dix fought hard to change. Dix had spent some of her younger years as a teacher, but after inheriting a fortune from a wealthy grandparent, she instead shifted her life's focus towards humanitarianism. She'd take a trip to the UK, where she would make a circle of friends who were all advocating for something called lunacy reform, a movement intended to better the care of the mentally ill, which would eventually result in publicly run institutions that were solely dedicated to caring for people who were described back in those days as lunatics. Dorothea would bring
instead of calling them like mental illness or disorders, you'll call them motherfuckers lunatics. That's crazy. Wow.
This idea back to the USA. Her efforts would result in a new kind of public institution called insane asylums. These weren't places for patients to receive structured treatment. They were instead designed to provide something called moral therapy. The idea was that a calm environment surrounded by nature, fresh air, and sunlight may be enough to quiet the mind of a disturbed individual. This was the philosophy that the Mississippi State Insane Asylum was built around. Christened in 1855, the institution was built on a plot of land consisting of 140 acres of...
Could y'all work in the insane asylum? I don't think I could. And it's not about like, oh, it says insane asylum, but it's like it's the niggas that send it, man. Nowadays, you don't like nowadays, bro, shit get crazy. People in asylums, it's like they're really, I don't know how to put it. I just don't know how to put it, but I couldn't work in no insane asylum. I couldn't. Nah, fuck no, bro. Imagine you working at your desk, and like, let me see if y'all can see me from right here. Y'all see me? Y'all see me? Imagine somebody like this. What are you doing? And then run to you. Fuck no.
Greenery. A farm was built next to the hospital with the intention of not only providing residents with some light therapeutic outdoor work, but also to make the whole asylum self-sustaining. By the time Dorothea Dix had passed away in 1887, the Mississippi State Insane Asylum was housing around 500 patients. By all accounts, her vision had panned out. People suffering from all manner of mental illness and disorders now had a place to go instead of being relegated to a life of imprisonment or homelessness. Fast forward 130 years. It's now 2012, and a construction crew is preparing to build a road on some of the land once owned by the now long defunct asylum. The work had to stop though, as just 1 foot below the surface, a worker digging would discover a single pine coffin. A group of archaeologists are called in, and a detailed excavation of the area is carried out, revealing 65 more identical coffins, all containing human remains.
Oh shit.
It's not terribly surprising that people died and were buried in a place that was designed for them.
Y'all want to know what's crazy? Y'all want to know what I heard? And I don't know if it's real or not, but when you bury your significant other, or like, not significant other, like when you bury anybody, you get the casket and you get them all nice and all this and that, blah, blah. Once you leave, and like once you have like the bury, you send them down the coffin, this and that. They would dig it back up. Take the person that's in the coffin out of the coffin, put them back in the dirt, and reuse the same coffin.
Them to live out their entire lives, but still, this had been a public institution. These graves weren't recorded anywhere.
Is it true? Let me know.
The world of insane asylums had been one of secrecy, and the internal history of these places mostly occurred behind closed doors, far away from the public eye. So a geophysical survey of the entire plot of land once owned by the hospital would be carried out a year later in 2013, just in the off chance there were more bodies spread out around the large slice of Earth. After the survey concluded, it would indeed result in the discovery of more bodies. Not just 1 or 2, or 10, or 100, or 1,000. In total, up to 7,000 bodies were discovered buried in about 20 acres of land. This was enough to draw national attention.
Holy shit.
People are stunned at the sheer volume of corpses this asylum had produced in only about 80 years. Authorities would begin exhuming the bodies for further examination. The coffins they were found in were very small and narrow, with many corpses having to be bent in awkward ways to be able to fit inside them. While the remains were nothing more than skeletons at this point, a surprising amount of information could still be garnered to flesh out these individual stories. Age, sex, height, ancestry, these could all be determined just from the bones, as well as evidence of past trauma. This is where things get even darker. These skeletons were full of huge dents, breaks, fractures, and segments that were soft and deformed as a result of extreme nutritional deficiencies. These people didn't simply pass away peacefully as a result of natural causes. They suffered grave mistreatment, which almost certainly contributed to their deaths. Look, I could tell you the whole story of this asylum. I started out with a noble mission that soon soured as a result of overcrowding, mismanagement, and a lack of understanding of mental health and psychology in general. I could tell you about the countless records of patients who were damned to this awful decrepit place, who weren't even mentally ill at all, and were simply sent there because somebody complained about them to the state, and that was enough to get them sent away for life. The problem is, the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum is just so typical. This isn't a special place. There are hundreds of these mental hospitals like this spread out around every corner of the USA, and they all had similar track records. Back in those days, people often didn't know what was happening in these places. Individuals who were mentally ill, suffering from neurological disorders, or people who just simply didn't conform to the strict cultural standards of the time were sent to these institutions to be forgotten. It wasn't just that they were secretive and hiding atrocities behind closed doors, but the people at the time also just weren't really paying much attention. Today, though, we know exactly the horrible things that were happening in these little slices of hell. And in this video, we're going to talk about some particularly dark examples. I gotta warn you, what lays ahead of us is extremely disturbing, unusually so for this channel. If you're somebody who's easily upset, especially when vulnerable people face grave mistreatment, you may want to watch one of my other videos. Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here.
Let's lock in.
On a cold September day in 1887, the same year Dorothea Dix died, as the Mississippi State Asylum was rapidly deteriorating, a woman is being led into a different mental hospital. This one isn't in the South. It's in New York, Blackwell Island Insane Asylum. This institution had been running since 1839. The idea behind it resembled that of its Mississippi counterpart. It was situated on Blackwell Island in the East River, a then quiet strip of mostly undeveloped land. It was intended to be a calm, therapeutic environment, but just like in Mississippi, overcrowding and neglect would swiftly ruin that mission. The facility was designed to house around 200 patients, but by 1870, it was home to 1,300.
God damn.
They'd attempt to solve the overcrowding problem by removing all the men, making the hospital women only. But that only removed about 25% of patients, as women were disproportionately overrepresented in these asylums. New York City in this era was being strained from an influx of new immigrants from the old world, and they were hard up for cash as a result. To save money, the city would use convicts from a nearby prison to act as nurses and attendants to the patients in Blackwell. Instead of hiring doctors, they would hire students that were still in medical school. This was the facility Nellie Brown was now being led into. She was previously housed in a women's shelter, but staff had her committed after other residents complained about her.
They don't even know what the fuck to do. They don't even know how to even care for these people. You gotta learn on the fly. I'm still a fucking student.
acting erratically. In less than 48 hours, Nellie had gone from the women's shelter to standing in front of a judge at a courtroom to seeing a doctor for a physical examination to walking in the front doors of Blackwell.
Wow.
However, the moment she passed through that threshold, Nellie seemed to change. Her 1,000-yard stare vanished and her incoherent babble ceased. There's a good reason.
She was happy?
Nellie is not crazy. In fact, this was all planned. Nellie Brown was actually Nellie Bly, an investigative reporter working for the New York World. She had spent weeks practicing and planning a strategy to get sent to Blackwell as a patient. Her intention was to report on the conditions from the inside, from the perspective of a patient. Dropping the act wasn't part of the plan, though. She had only done that because of how shocked she was at the truly vile conditions of the Blackwell Insane Asylum.
Wait, but like, what if like she stopped acting, or like, you know how like you can trick yourself into like, or like self-diagnosis, or like tricking yourself into believing that's who you are, and then you actually become that person, or what you say you are. Excuse me.
Right after walking through the front door, she had known it would be bad. That was the whole reason Joseph Pulitzer had sent her on this assignment. There were stirrings in New York surrounding the deteriorating conditions at Blackwell, but these facilities tended to be secretive, and the true scope of the horrors weren't publicly known. After removing all the men in 1870, the hospital had recorded 900 patients, more than 4 times its maximum occupancy.
Jesus.
But when Nellie arrived 17 years later, it was housing 1,600. Continual budget cuts had left only 16 medical professionals on staff, approximately 1 for every 100 patients. So as Nellie was ingested into the system,
I believe these are the students that went in, and now look at them. They old as hell.
1 for every 100 patients. As Nellie was ingested into the system, she was only given a thin cotton flannel slip for clothing. The building was incredibly cold. All the windows were kept open year-round, regardless of the outside temperature. Some patients were given thin, moth-eaten shawls as a reward for good behavior, and these were considered a coveted item among the population at Blackwell. Nellie was told to sit on a bench beside a few other patients. This was a single daily activity at the asylum, sitting motionless for up to 12 hours at a time. Moving or speaking to fellow patients is strictly forbidden.
What the fuck?
At the end of the day, she's led to a straw-stuffed pallet with an oilcloth cover. This is her bed. Even if she could get comfortable, she wouldn't get much sleep anyways. Multiple orderlies would regularly make the rounds, counting out patients loud enough that there were barely ever any truly quiet moments during the night.
Wow.
The next morning, she's brought to an area to eat some breakfast. Rats are weaving their way between her and her fellow patients' feet. Garbage is piling up everywhere. Once again, Bly spends her day sitting motionless on a hard wooden bench, squished between other patients. Some residents wouldn't sit still, so the nurses would tie them up with ropes. Sometimes, though, they wouldn't stop there. Bly would experience the nurses, whom I will remind you are mostly convicts that were living out sentences at a nearby prison, acting sadistically towards patients on multiple occasions. A resident named Mrs. Grady would start chattering to herself, which would prompt a nearby nurse to throw her down and drag her across the floor by her hair. Another unnamed patient was sat upon and throttled by a nurse who noticed her crying.
I thought that was supposed to fucking help me get better. Y'all making me get worse.
Sometimes the brutality was completely unprompted. For no apparent reason, a nurse would begin hitting a patient known as Mrs. Cotter with a broom handle. He'd then start pulling out her hair by the fistfuls. Occasionally, a doctor would walk by, and the patients would all begin complaining about the mistreatment, only to have it all dismissed as delusions. Perhaps the most disturbing thing Nellie saw.
Bro, get the fuck. I would have killed him. I'm not gonna bap. If I was one of these pages, man, fuck it. Y'all think I'm crazy? Oh, I'm gonna show you crazy. That's it. Touch me again, you're fucking dead.
Was the mental states of her fellow patients. While some of them were indeed suffering from different forms of debilitating mental illness or neurological disorders, many weren't. A large amount of the patients Bly interacted with on a daily basis were completely sane. They had been sent to Blackwell for a number of unjust reasons. One patient had been sent there after her husband reported her to the state for supposedly taking an interest in other men. Another had been sent there after merely collapsing from overwork one day at her job. Many others were immigrants that didn't speak any English. They were sent to Blackwell because they were unable to communicate during their court hearings and physical examinations, so they were sent to an insane asylum to live out the rest of their life. Possibly even more disturbing, however, was how the staff treated Nellie herself. She had stopped pretending to be crazy the moment she walked into the asylum, yet nobody who worked there seemed to notice. They still treated her as if she was a lunatic. They would start pointing out her normal, everyday quirks as evidence of her insanity. She would eventually start making pleas to be released, but these would not only go unanswered, but they would be put into her record as symptoms of her madness.
What?
It would take her newspaper getting involved to actually get her released, which would happen 10 days after she was initially committed. Nellie had documented everything that happened to her while she was on the inside, and she'd put it all together in the form of multiple long-form articles that would eventually be turned into a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse. The case would instantly explode. This was a detailed peek into an overlooked and secretive world, and people were shocked at how bad things really were. A grand jury would be convened to investigate the conditions at the asylum, and though the staff at Blackwell made a last-ditch effort to clean the place up before the investigators visited, who were immediately told that everything Nellie had wrote were lies, the jury ultimately sided with Bly. The staff members who had been mistreating patients were all fired, and multiple budget increases and new regulations were penned in an effort to improve conditions in all of New York's public facilities, much to the satisfaction of Nellie Bly, who would go on to become one of the most influential journalists of her day, inspiring many other women to get into journalism, and in turn creating an entire genre of women-led investigative reporting. Nellie Bly's investigation into Blackwell may have been the first peek we've gotten behind the walls of a typical insane asylum, but it wouldn't be the last. More information about other such institutions would come out in the decades that followed, some contemporary for their time, but many would only surface years later as a result of some investigation that unearths previously forgotten about records and documents that all detail horrible things. Despite the horrors that Nellie Bly brought to the public eye, conditions would still continue to be unbelievably inhumane at the many insane asylums that existed around the USA. And in fact, the people in charge of these establishments would begin to introduce new elements that would drag down the lives of their patients to new and terrifying low.
Yo, quick break. If you are enjoying the video and you messing with my takes or how I commentate throughout the video, and my reactions, you feel me? Make sure you subscribe to Remy Boy Reacts and like the video, share with some people that might find me interesting to watch. And let's get back to the video.
For illnesses that were previously thought to be untreatable, they could also perform surgery much more safely. They could now prescribe a new kind of medication called an antibiotic that would magically treat different infections. These few years at the turn of the 20th century would see the start of the gradual but enormous rise in life expectancy that would take place over the next 100 years. But as revolutionary as germ theory was, it wasn't fully understood right off the bat, and the early years of doctors exploring these new concepts would be rife with pseudoscience. One such scientific dead end was something called focal sepsis. This was a theory that suggested bacteria could travel from the site of an infection to other parts of the body through the bloodstream to create new infections. Supposedly, these secondary infections could manifest much like the primary one they originated from. But doctors also thought that if bacteria were to enter the brain, it could cause psychiatric symptoms. By the 1910s, it was generally accepted in medical science that infections in unrelated parts of the body may be the cause of various neurological disorders and mental illnesses. One pioneer of this theory was Dr. Henry Cotton, the medical director at the New Jersey State Hospital, an insane asylum that had been founded in 1848. He had come into this position in 1907, and the early years of his tenure were marked with genuine efforts to improve the conditions for the patients living there. He abolished the use of mechanical restraints, improved staff-to-patient ratios, and began requiring workers to convene in daily meetings to discuss patient care. It's clear he did genuinely want to improve things for his patients, which makes it a little hard to believe the atrocities that would follow.
I knew it.
Dr. Cotton had also installed a laboratory in the asylum, complete with a surgical facility. In 1913, he would set out to use the principles of focal sepsis to find treatments for lunacy and madness. His core hypothesis was that the patients in his asylum may have some unseen infections somewhere on their bodies that were sending bacteria and other toxins to their brains, and that by identifying these infections and then surgically removing them, they could be cured of their madness. He would begin with the teeth. It became routine at the New Jersey State Hospital for patients to have all their teeth pulled.
What?
This wouldn't result in improvements to any patient's condition, but Cotton would justify it by saying the infections had likely spread further into the body and that they simply needed to go deeper. The tonsils would be next on the list, but again, every patient who had their tonsils extracted saw no meaningful change in their condition. He would then deem the sinuses to be the next hiding places of these mystery infections, and patients would begin systematically getting their sinuses drained. Again, no meaningful improvements. At this point, Dr. Cotton had begun weaving in a new theory into his practice: auto-intoxication. This was the idea that the bacteria present in the intestinal tract could leak out and cause infections, so Cotton would begin surgically removing pieces of his patients' digestive tracts. Stomachs, gallbladders, spleens, all of these would be removed on many patients residing in the asylum. But the most common procedure by far was the removal of the large intestine. After all, that's where the majority of your gut bacteria resides. During Dr. Cotton's tenure at New Jersey State Hospital, he would perform a total of 645 colectomies, treating conditions ranging from schizophrenia to mild depression. What makes the situation even worse was that Dr. Henry Cotton wasn't even a trained surgeon. He was completely self-taught, and he personally carried out every procedure. The hospital also didn't have any antibiotics on hand, and these factors would lead to a death rate as high as 45%. Hundreds of patients had died during surgery, and the thousands that did survive were left permanently maimed. Like this anonymous 18-year-old girl, whom we only know about as a result of recovered patient records. She had entered the asylum because of her agitated depression, and over the course of her stay, Dr. Cotton would remove all her teeth in her tonsils, drain her sinuses, remove her cervix, and cut out a large section of her intestinal tract. These surgeries would result in no improvement to her psychiatric condition, and they would only serve to greatly worsen her physical health. It wouldn't be hard to come to the conclusion that Dr. Cotton was simply a sadist, somebody who enjoys hurting other people. But he very likely did genuinely believe in everything he was doing. He would also experiment on his own family, having all the teeth pulled from his wife's and both of his sons' heads. He would also perform a colectomy on his young teeth. Everything he was doing. He would also experiment on his own family, having all the teeth pulled from his wife's and both of his sons' heads. He would also perform a colectomy on his younger son. These procedures must have proven to be unthinkably traumatic, as both of his sons would take their lives. Dr. Cotton would die a celebrated and venerated figure in 1933, the true breadth of his atrocities not yet known to the general public. He himself had claimed an 85% success rate for the procedures he performed, even though that was in all likelihood a completely made-up number. The truth wouldn't be publicly known until the 2000s, when sociologist Andrew Scull would begin meticulously reading through patient records, letters, and asylum archives, an effort that would result in his 2005 book, Madhouse, A Tragic Tale of Megalomania in Modern Medicine. It's worth mentioning that everything Cotton did had been performed without the consent of his patients. People who were kept in these asylums did not possess legal competence, and thus doctors were basically free to do whatever they wanted to them without any sort of permission. Patient consent not being considered necessary in this era would lead to many similar atrocities happening all over the United States. Possibly the most unsettling of these human experiments, and undoubtedly the most disturbing thing I've ever read about, is the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments on children.
I'm not working here.
Between
I would never work in a mental asylum.
1956 and 1971, researchers led by Dr. Saul Krugman of New York University would start handing out glasses of chocolate milk to the residents of a ward for intellectually disabled children in the Willowbrook State School, one of countless institutions suffering from the same overcrowding and neglect issues we've been talking about throughout this video. These drinks were spiked with hepatitis. Every child who ingested this drink would become severely ill. If I'm being honest, I don't really want to get into the details here. It's just truly vile and awful things happening to the most vulnerable people. It goes a little beyond your average sense of morbid curiosity. Just know that the children of this ward suffered immensely. This experiment was done in an effort to develop a vaccine for hepatitis, but that was unsuccessful, and the ethical failure would directly lead to the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act being penned into law in 1980, which would slowly lead to the dismantling of the asylum system as we've known it throughout this video. Now at this point you might be thinking, can it really get any worse? Keep in mind, those human experiments, while undoubtedly cruel and inhumane, were done under the guise of helping people. Those experiments at Willowbrook, for example. The idea is comically evil, but the doctor in charge of the program had done a similar experiment a few years earlier that resulted in a new vaccine for measles, which stopped an epidemic in its tracks at the very same asylum, in turn saving hundreds of lives. This next asylum, though, it's hard to find any sort of good intentions behind the atrocities that would occur there. The Philadelphia-based Bybury Asylum opened in 1907 as a sort of rural spillover to lighten the load on the nearby urban asylums that were becoming dangerously overcrowded. It wouldn't take long, however, for Bybury itself to become alarmingly overcapacity, as starting in 1913, the city of Philadelphia would start using the institution as its primary location for housing the insane. The campus would expand over the following decades to accommodate the massive influx of people, eventually reaching 50 buildings with a network of underground tunnels that snake between them. Still though, the hospital couldn't keep up with its growing population of patients. By 1947, 6,100 souls called Bybury home, 3,600 more than its rated capacity of 2,500. The staff couldn't keep up either. Bybury was unable to recruit new doctors and nurses quickly enough, so they would eliminate all requirements and background checks in an effort to get more employees onboarded. This would result in the majority of staff at Bybury being completely unqualified for their positions, and many workers had only taken their jobs because they were desperate and had no other options. Like almost everything else we've talked about today, the atrocities at Bybury would only come out later as a result of investigative reporting. The methods the untrained workers would use to restrain patients were so cruel that they're a little hard to talk about on YouTube. One of them was called a water cure, which was essentially a combination of waterboarding and neck wringing. It would cause several patients to die. In fact, murder was a regular part of life at Bybury, whether it was staff on patient or patient on patient. There was only one staff member for every 400 residents at the hospital, and as a result, there was little oversight. Sometimes the patient would be killed and their body would just be left in the hallway for days before a staff member would happen across it. In one occurrence of this happening, and luckily I won't tell you the brutal manner this particular patient passed away in, but doctors would only discover the killing after other patients were seen playing with her teeth. Possibly the most tragic part of this place was the children's ward. Rather than using actual orderlies and nurses to manage this unit, the doctors would instead recruit adult patients to be in charge of it. I'm sure you can imagine how that worked out. The medical treatments patients had to endure at Bybury somehow may be the worst we've come across today. The doctors had a policy of not offering any sort of pain management or sedation for medical procedures, as they believed that lunatics did not feel pain. Invasive procedures would be performed on patients who could feel every little horrible thing that was happening to them. It was also commonplace for patients to be tied down with restraints on them for extended periods of time. In 1987, yes, not 27, 87, the Eastern Pennsylvania U.S. District Court would hear the case of William Kirsch, a man who had been held in 4-point restraints for 3 years straight. Imagine all your limbs being tied down for 3 years.
Bro, what the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck were we doing? What are we doing? That's the most crazy shit I ever heard. No, not even crazy shit. This is one of the most crazy shit I ever heard. You was restrained and tied down, all your limbs tightened for 3 years straight. Oh, fuck out of here. No way.
He had multiple broken bones, severe muscle.
No, now that will make somebody go insane. You will lose your fucking marbles. I know I would.
Muscle atrophy and suffered extreme psychological deterioration as a result of his ordeal. 3 years later in 1990, the asylum would close for good. Its entire existence was marred by constant controversy, yet the state just simply didn't have anywhere else to send people for inpatient mental health care, so it persisted through the years as an ugly sore, something that you can't really get rid of. So instead, you just cover it up and hope that nobody comments on it. The same can be said for the whole of the 19th and 20th century mental asylum system. These places were secretive, and they did try desperately to cover up their wrongdoings, but the public leaders who held the power to actually do something about these horrible places usually just left them alone. Scandals would break out and the public would get terribly angry, but then they would just forget about it, and nothing would change. It really does mirror the historical treatment of people with mental illness or neurological disorders. For most of history, these individuals were kept in the shadows. They were seen as an embarrassment or something to be ashamed of, and thus people just weren't interested in how they were being treated. It's nice that things are better now, but it's scary to think that a lot of these cruelties occurred in North America during the lifespans of many of my viewers. It's not as far away from the modern day as you might think. Anyways, thank you very much for making it to the end. Since you're still here, why don't you consider hitting that subscribe button? Only if you enjoyed the video though. It'll make the YouTube algorithm serve you up more videos like this one. I've got a Twitter that I'll link below if you want to follow me off YouTube. And last but not least, thank you all for watching. Have a good night.